Babylon will be captured. Bel will be put to shame. Marduk filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame and her idols filled with terror. A nation from the north will attack her and lay waste her land. No one will live in it. Both men and animals will flee away.
Yes, Babylon looked impregnable. Its power and its wealth dominated the ancient Near East, but so did its cruelty and its rank idolatry. As we saw at the Tower of Babel, God does not forever tolerate human pride and arrogance. In his mercy, God tried to warn Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar began having troubling dreams, but they were dreams of warning from the Creator God himself. Nebuchadnezzar did not know all this happening. Neither did anyone in his court, except one, a young Jewish captive, a man of God named Daniel.
Babylon, past, present, and future.
Nebuchadnezzar had built the greatest empire of the ancient Near East. As a general, he was unsurpassed. He was also a very shrewd ruler. When the king's armies had carried Daniel and other prominent citizens of Jerusalem back to Babylon, Daniel was placed in Nebuchadnezzar's own court.
And ancient kings often chose foreigners to fill those key spots because they are not the threat to the throne that someone of their own ethnic or national identity would be. So you use a foreigner, like a Jew, because you use his ability, but at the same time, you're not threatened by that individual.
Among this select group were Daniel and his three companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Although they were captives, they remained completely loyal to the true God, the God of Israel. Their experiences of standing up to materialism and idolatry are among the best-known stories of the Bible. When Daniel's three friends refused to worship a golden statue which Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the enraged king committed them to the famous fiery furnace.
Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods."
For once outflanked, the astonished Nebuchadnezzar called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to his side. The fire had not harmed their bodies, nor did they smell of smoke. In an amazing turnabout, Nebuchadnezzar praised the God who had sent his angel to rescue them. He promoted them to high positions in his kingdom. The relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar was a strange one indeed. On one hand, there was Nebuchadnezzar, pagan ruler of the known world, whose dazzling accomplishments rested on military force and slave labor. On the other, a young Jewish captive brought from his homeland to Babylon, a servant of the one true God, yet loyal to his new king.
Nebuchadnezzar is presented as being, at least in the book of Daniel, somewhat sympathetic to the God of Israel and the God of Daniel. But to call Nebuchadnezzar someone who has placed his faith in the God of Israel and Daniel, I would say no. These ancient kings were great politicians, and they made decisions on that which was based, they felt, in terms of their own favor.
It was while Daniel was captive in Babylon that he and the king began having disturbing dreams and visions. God was giving them both insight into the future. The second chapter of the book of Daniel records one particularly disturbing dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel describes it.
You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the wind carried them away, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
No wonder this dream troubled Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel told the king both what he had seen and gave him an interpretation, a revelation from God himself. The head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar's empire. The silver, bronze, and part iron, part clay portions of the statue represented successive kingdoms. Each was inferior to the one before. The stone symbolized the ever-ruling kingdom of God, the unseen God who determines the fate of all kingdoms, including Nebuchadnezzar's. When Nebuchadnezzar heard this interpretation, he fell on his face before Daniel. Once again, he praised the God of Israel. But the old arrogance soon reasserted itself. The book of Daniel portrays Nebuchadnezzar in the mold of many dictators we've seen strut across the stage of history. He was filled with pride and given to fits of rage. He controlled a great empire, but he couldn't control himself. Daniel warned Nebuchadnezzar that the God who controlled all the kingdoms of the earth would humble him if he didn't change his ways. The warnings fell on deaf ears. Instead of giving God the glory, Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as the source of greatness. The book of Daniel describes how God humbled this proud king and how God taught him there was